My Govanin, and welcome back to Medieval Art. I'm Dr. Bryan Keene, and it's a joy to be joined again with Dave Lewis of Cinemillennials, where we're going to be talking more about the Rings of Power in the broader context of Tolkien's Legendarium, thinking specifically about the theme of adaptation. In reading through each book and by in a larger Earth series, we constantly come back to this idea of how the world is developing and think often about how others have come to this work, how artists, writers, directors, cinematographers, animators, and more have brought the worlds of Middle-earth to life. So Dave, in thinking now after a few weeks of reflecting upon the Rings of Power, where are you at in this broader scope of the theme of adaptation in Tolkien studies and
In
Tolkien's
relation
world?
to the Rings of Power, I feel that it is half an adaptation, half an exploration. I think it is very much in line of Tolkien's ideas from his very famous letter sketching the whole Legendarium as a whole, um, as using keeping space for other minds and hands to develop drama, music, tales, and so on and so forth. I think it does fit within an adaptation to a certain degree. The strongest adaptation kind of thing that it does have is its adherence to themes, whether it be pride and greed, the oaths, and how we swear oaths despite not realizing or not thinking about what the consequences of those oaths are, the trauma of war, and how Tolkien's a hybrid approach of medieval heroic epics with the 20th century stark realism of his time in the First World War and the effects of the war that had not only on himself personally and spiritually, but his generation, not only human generations, but nature as a whole. So I think there are a lot of things here that we're going to be discussing, not only about the Rings of Power, but the other adaptations and how they pass or fail certain criterion for Tolkien's Legendarium.
Well, I'm curious, when you've read through Tolkien, what was your starting point? Because I know for me, I started, in fact, with the Lord of the Rings series, and then found myself going back and reading The Hobbit, and only later the Silmarillion and all the other writings associated with that. And for me, I came to the Lord of the Rings when the Peter Jackson trilogies were first making space in theaters in 2001 through 3. And it was then ahead of watching those that I wanted to go back and know the world, but didn't come to works like the Silmarillion until much later, and didn't discover the greater world of the animated films and all the artistry that was long associated with it. So Peter Jackson was, I think, for many in our generation, an entry point, even if the books for me came before the films in that way. But really, it was knowing the films were coming out that I wanted to go read the books in greater detail. I always knew of their existence and had read little bits. C.S. Lewis, as I think I've told you before, was more of the entry point into this fantasy realm. But I'm curious, in terms of these adaptations, how you first came to thinking about the world. I know we talked before about our backstories, but what was the sequencing for you in approaching the world?
I think it was seeing the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring in theaters in 2001, day after Christmas. I think that was the first thing, or really, it might have been even before that, the lead up to that. I was, as a kid, I loved medieval history, loved medieval arms and armor, saw that stuff, and I was like, holy crap, that's amazing. Um, but I also think it was seeing the commercials from Burger King, because I still have the Burger King glasses, like I said before. Um, and then also, so I saw the movies. I was like, of course, I want to read the books. They were a little too hard. But at the same time, I think there was a recollection. I have a recollection of trying to read The Hobbit before the movies came out or something like that. But it was always something that was like in the ether kind of thing before really getting into it. And then from there, I really didn't read The Lord of the Rings until I was, I think, 21 or 22. I got a 50th anniversary edition, the gold leaf pages, leather bound, everything like that. And I was like, right, I'm gonna read it all the way through. It took me around a year because I'm a slower reader, but bawled my eyes out at the end. It's completely different from the movies. It's especially in the ending, but it was something that made such an impact for me that I'm like, all right, I'm going to read this every 5 years. So I'm currently in my reading cycle right now. And it's just interesting to reflect on what's happening within this adaptation with the Rings of Power and then reflecting on all the other adaptations. I think from there, after I read that, I went through the Hobbit stuff, through Rankin and Bass. I went through the Return of the King, Rankin Bass, the Bakshi ones as well. And they're all so vastly different from each other. And they all so vastly adhere or don't adhere to the original text that they're trying to adapt. And I think one of the best ones for adaptation is definitely Rankin Bass's Hobbit version. I love that one. I think it's so very much in line with Tolkien's kind of whimsy and fairy story kind of realities and feelings that we get across. I mean, the music is always great from Rankin and Bass, as we know, through the constant holiday adaptations or holiday stories that they create, whether it be Rudolph or Frosty or Santa Claus is Coming to Town or any one of those. But I think that one of those, what that does really well was create that sense of whimsy, create that sense of reality as well as that whimsy.
Well, I think two things that stood out in your discussion. I think being a slow reader with Tolkien is fine because there's so much to digest. I find myself as well needing to go back, or even at times reading quickly over certain parts and then realizing later that I need to go back and remind myself, wait, what was the sequence of these events? But the other point, I think you're absolutely right. If we think back to 1977 with the Rankin and Bass Hobbit film coming out, and then years later with their Return of the King, which itself was a response to the Bakshi Lord of the Rings from 78, those films really did have something of the childlike whimsy as you described. And I think we remember that Tolkien sort of resisted animation to a certain extent.
Right.
And yet those worlds did give us a glimpse into what was possible. When at a time, I can't really imagine in the 1970s and early 80s, a live action Lord of the Rings that would have felt authentic. It would have felt maybe a little cheesy thinking about other films, fantasy films that came out at the time. But I do love the way in which the Bakshi film specifically had an impact on Peter Jackson. And there are these one-to-one parallels between the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Bakshi films. Or film. And I think that it's that sense of artists looking at other artists, and in this case, filmmakers looking at other filmmakers who have given life to Middle Earth. And we see so much of that in the Rings of Power, that there was already a world created by Jackson that you couldn't diverge too much. The elves needed to look a certain way, and you needed the realm of the dwarves to look a certain way that felt believable in what we expect as fans. And that's where I think your point about adaptation and exploration is really interesting, that there was a certain level of fandom that needed to be adhered to in terms of getting buy-in. But then this idea of exploration is a curious one, as we're going not only into new realms of Middle Earth that we've not yet seen, but new areas of Tolkien's world making. And Tolkien's world making that was always under development, even upon his death. And if we think about the Second Age and the First Age, the events of the Silmarillion and later leading into The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, this was work that he thought about from the very beginning of his career, and that he would leave to Christopher Tolkien to then adapt and bring together. And then more recently with Bryan Sibley and others who are bringing together still more of these tales. So tell us more about this idea of exploration as you have been thinking about it in relation to the Rings of Power and the greater Tolkien Legendarium.
Yeah, I mean, my what I think is what a lot of people are missing from the Rings of Power and its full context is that, like you said, Tolkien worked throughout his whole life developing these characters, developing these stories, developing their mythos, developing their philosophy, developing their religious beliefs, developing their economic beliefs, much to George R.R. Martin's critical chagrin. I found myself more and more being affiliated with the Silmarillion as a whole. I think it's a much deeper story. I think it's something that's way more personal to Tolkien, that explains a lot about not only that world, but our world in general. I got that through listening to the audio adaptation, not audio adaptation, the audio recording, the audio book. Although he does mispronounce a lot of things. But I think that there is this exploration, because Tolkien talks about this other minds and hands idea, is that the showrunners said at the very beginning that they wanted to develop a gap. They wanted to fill that gap that Tolkien left, which a lot of people understandably were very nervous about. And clearly from our kind of perspectives, our talks, can kind of reflect on that, especially myself with their idea of Sauron and Anatar and the exclusion of that. Um, and the possible probably adaptation that that will be developing into in the next season. As they said that they have Círdan, they're getting other actors as well. So it'll be interesting to see where they go with that, where they go with the full scope of the story and the corruption of the elves, men, and dwarves, as well as the other peoples around them. So I think it'll be definitely interesting to see why we're exploring these things. We're also getting into ideas from your background with art history and how a lot of the things are clearly being affected by the past, and how I feel I've said this a lot that Tolkien fans love this stuff because of its materiality, where it is a sense of something that really belonged to the past, even though it didn't. It feels that real world gap of history, of beauty, of this idea of nature filling us, despite having the constant world around us being so industrialized, so technologically advanced in a way. But I think that with these adaptations, why people constantly go and want to adapt and to explore the ideas. We're getting Rune in the next season. It seems like we're getting things that we've never ever seen before, things that and ideas that we've never explored before in these other adaptations that we're going to be talking about before. And I think that's really a nice fresh breath of air if they do it with fidelity towards Tolkien's writings and his belief systems.
It's interesting because this theme of fidelity is really an important one, because there is something of the ethos of the world that we want to feel that the world is authentic, that it's believable, that the events transpire in a way that would be true to Tolkien's world, even if they're slightly different, or if we can say adapt a little bit. I will say, your point earlier about the Rankin and Bass, and then even, Bakshi, those films, what I think did so well was the inclusion of song and the music that felt so true to Tolkien. So even when events were different, we at least had the songs on the road, and we got some of that glimpse, because the sung word in Tolkien is so essential, from the Ainu Lindale all the way through The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I think with the Peter Jackson films, there were really specific decisions in the plot that spoke to the greater arc of the story as Jackson understood it. And so we see an increase in the presence of Arwen, for example. And I know there's still been a lot of pushback about losing a character like Glorfindel and others in giving a character like Arwen greater screen time. I know when I first saw the film, I was a little bit bothered that we didn't have Tom Bombadil, for example. But I understand in listening to the writer's decisions that it would have felt like so much of a diversion, in a way that literature, you can sort of sit with it and you have that time to realize, yes, they're in the forest and they're getting lost and they're meandering. And there is this opportunity for unexpected events to happen. In a movie, you need to move the plot forward. At the same time, I felt that losing the Scouring of the Shire at the end of The Return of the King was so sad. In a way, I understood that we can't have one great tragedy and the defeat of a great evil in Sauron only to return home to a world so affected by evil. And yet that was the world that Tolkien himself returns to after the First World War, and then sees in the Second World War that the world is never perfect after the destruction of an evil. And this line from Galadriel at the beginning of The Rings of Power, that nothing is evil from the beginning, and yet we see a constant return to evil. Even after the last alliance, evil still finds a foothold in this world. And so that was one instance, I think, in the Jackson films that I still find myself debating over, that we did get a glimpse in the Palantir, not in the Palantir, but in Galadriel's mirror, rather, with Sam's vision that, yes, there could be this Scouring of the Shire moment, but those are instances where I think as a fan, you sort of sit with it and you accept it in the world that's been created for you. That is the world of the Jackson adaptation. And ditto, this idea that Anatar's character wouldn't have made sense in the Rings of Power because the elves could not be so easily duped. In that sense, I feel like perhaps does not either give space enough for Tolkien's world making to allow a character that could be so convincing and so beautiful and so alluring that he could have deceived even the wisest of the elves. I think that was something that I would have liked to see play out, and I'm willing to say might see it in future. So I don't know how, and I know I've thrown out a lot of things, but those are some of the points that still stick out in my mind as a major fan who still loves all of these worlds, but finds myself thinking, how does this either sit with or not sit with the world that Tolkien has created?
Right. And I think it does to a certain degree. Like it does, like I've said before, the themes are the strongest part about this show, until you drop off a little bit, where, you're getting things that are, okay, well, this doesn't, like we're talking about whether this works or not in the world. The idea of Celebrimbor being like this changed like immediately. Like, are you really looking at them as a whole? Are you looking at as a bigger arc, the story arc? Are you looking at this is the now, this is the thing that we have to get to, this is the point that we have to get to for these people? Okay, so you're doing that, but men are the constantly, as always said, men are the easiest corrupted. So I understand where they're like, people are trying to grasp for that idea with the Southlanders, saying that, oh yeah, they were like, oh, he's our king, he's our king. But at the same time, you don't really convince them to say that. And at the same time, I think still, to your point, talking about songs and music and how important that is to Tolkien, and how important poetry is to Tolkien, and how that really solidifies the mythologies that we get in Tolkien's world, that we get these ideas of like how you and I and everybody else that probably loves the Lord of the Rings has an equally as big passion for mythologies, for the stories, for legends, for things like that. Often, a lot of times, people's entry point to Tolkien are Arthurian legends, are different knightly kind of courtly things like that. People often get those two. That's a gateway into Tolkien. And I think that a lot of that stuff is missing because people don't know how to approach that. I think Jackson's trilogy, he wants to approach a quote unquote realism to this world. He wants to make it without the fairy story, even though Tolkien's so important on fairy story and how important fairy stories are to us, not only as children, but as adults. I think, and it's not about an escapism, it's about this is where we could possibly be if we want to be the best of who we can be. Or this is possibly how we can be if we choose the path to be the worst we can be. But I still think that the two options that we could have, and I think this is the best part about the Rings of Power, that is it is a show. It's not a film, because that time constraint really, really bars you from exploring the themes like the Scouring of the Shire, which I absolutely think is now, reading the book many times, things like that. I think it's an absolute failure on the part of Peter Jackson not to include that. I understand that probably the studio and the most kind of audience that they were looking for is an American audience during the 2000s, which are a very tumultuous time with the context of the Iraq and Afghanistan war. That was probably a major thing. I know there were a lot of talks about calling it the Twin Towers, the Two Towers, kind of stuff like that, with the allusions to that only a year after 2001. But it's interesting to see like how also the idea of an American audience being a focal point, an American audience for Hollywood, an American audience for, we're known for our happier endings, our kind of storybook, fairy tale, Disneyfied endings, which you talked about the idea, the exploration of animation before. You and I have talked about previously, if there is ever going to be a Silmarillion adaptation, it should be animation, because that is the thing that could give those people that develop it the most amount of freedom to really discuss the philosophical, the metaphysical world that Tolkien talks about and develops with his creation story, with his magic, with the dragons and things like that. That's how you can really make it believable. Whereas Tolkien even himself said that drama doesn't really lend itself to adapting mythologies and legends because of their mysticism, because of their ideas that you can't really get across to an audience visually. Like you said, it's really more about the written word there. And I think, again, that's what really fails in this idea of how we had to have a already specified idea of Tolkien's world from the Jackson trilogy to put on there, because I think that was one of the major things that failed within this show a little bit, was that people are so focused on silly things like the elves didn't have long hair, or where's Deeza's beard, even though it's already there. Things like that, that really, it doesn't further people to want to watch these things. It looks like, from people on the outside looking in, like, why do you guys care about this silly thing? It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. You're only focusing on something that is one person's or two people, John Howe, Alan Lee, all those guys, version of the world, not the world that you as a reader can develop into what your world can be.
Yeah, I mean, that's another good point, is that all of us as readers bring something to Tolkien. We've created our image of each of the characters. So we do have that expectation of the length of the hair, or the size of the beard, or the complexion of the skin, even in the case of many of the actors or characters. And then this response to some of the actors and actresses, which I think is a great addition to the world making, sort of expanding and opening up the world, an even more diverse world, which was always there in Tolkien, even if not as presented in the Jackson films. I think the other point you make is that there is still so much of the Alan Lee and John Howe influence on Jackson, and now, as we see in The Rings of Power. But then there are all the other artists along the way, Barbara Remington and the Hildebrandt brothers. I think of the Hildebrandt brothers also in relation to their images of Star Wars early on. So for me, I still see those images side by side of the galaxy far, far away and Middle Earth somewhere. And then, of course, Ted Naismith. And then you've introduced me, even just in our conversation before this recording, to Jenny Dolphin and Pauline Baines. I mean, there's so many individuals who create the world. And then let's think about cosplayers and other, TikTokers, people that are bringing the world to life. And that, to me, is the real beauty of Tolkien, is that there is the possibility for any number of adaptations. And I hope that going forward in the series, we do start to see a few of these themes connected even more. I hope the characterizations of the world and the individual characters coming out even more. I do think the time compression has been difficult, because even in rewatching the final episode, we were told that time has passed. Elrond asks for additional time in the creation of these objects of protection that they're going to make, ultimately the rings. And yet saying something and witnessing it over a series of weeks is very different. When you say in dialogue that, yes, we need more time and it's been granted, you can then imagine that, okay, that was the moment when Anatar, whom we don't name in the show, is corrupting Celebrimbor, and that's where he has that sort of fog or haze or forgetfulness towards the end. That's harder to believe when you don't see it in the episodic way that the weeks have been developed. If the event had happened in, let's say, episode 8, maybe I could have believed it by, or episode 6 or something. I could have believed it by the end that, yes, he's been so corrupted and this theme of deception has come to play. But when it happens in the course of a few minutes on screen, that's when it's harder to dispel belief. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I completely agree. If it was something like what I originally thought of, what it should have been, or what it could have been, was that we would see a long development of each race by each season over time, and how they were seduced towards accepting these rings, and how they were seduced into making these rings, into the eventual, we would see the long arc and then steep dive into ultimate chaos and what Anatar really does with each race. He plunges them into chaos, into cataclysmic events that really lead to the events of the Third Age and the fighting back. It just seems like it went by so quickly. I was not concerned about the time compression, because we'd have to have every other human character die each episode. But I do think that where that does well is that it is a show. It's a show that is able to go on, with Amazon's budget as much as they possibly can or want to. I know they said 5 seasons, but I think depending on how it goes, there probably could be more, or there could be more offshoots developing with these characters and within these the characters that we love so much. But I think that where we where this kind of develops into is this idea of how can we get as much as possible out of it while at the same time losing a lot of core ideas. And I'm worried about that in the next couple of seasons, how those will develop. Are they going to try to develop with a lot of the horrific things that happen in Numenor? How is that going to develop? How is the Civil War going to be justified, or not justified, shown across the board? How is that? Because these are, like we've said before, these are things that we've never seen before. So it'll be interesting to see how they're going to adapt and develop the things that they have the rights to on screen, because you don't really talk about within the appendices. There is really no mention of the Civil War at all. There's no mention of human sacrifices. There's no mention of this grand fight against, and this grand, almost underground resistance of the faithful. We don't get that. So it'll be interesting to see how they go with that. At the same time, I think one of the best adaptations that we get from the Lord of the Rings is the BBC radio adaptation. I think, we didn't really talk about that one just yet. And I think that one's highly underrated because of how it's so adherent to the majority of Tolkien's work. You don't miss the idea of Faramir. You don't miss, like Jackson does. You don't miss the songs. You don't miss Tom Bombadil. You get, or they didn't miss these characters and these people and their themes. You get the Scouring of the Shire. You get everything in one package. Meanwhile, you get a lot of really great actors like John LeMessurier. You get Bill Nighy, and then you even get Bill Nighy's Samwise Gamgee is a great adaptation for that character. And then you even get Ian Holm as Frodo.
Yeah.
So the connections between that adaptation and the Peter Jackson trilogy match up. And I think that's really lovely because that also happens within the Jules Bass editions as well. So I think it's really interesting how there are these kind of echoes of familiarity throughout the majority of these adaptations, how there is some connections where you also get great actor John Huston playing Gandalf for the Bass films as well. So you're getting a lot of people that are legendary within their own right, wanting to adapt these things and wanting them to get them right. But it's interesting to see how the Rings of Power has been consumed and how it's being put out there. Whereas the other things in the past, probably barring the audio books and the audio versions of the stories, is that there's heavy merchandising for all of these things. Whereas the Rings of Power, I don't think I've really seen a lot of merchandising, which is utterly surprising to me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is something to be gained financially off the series. And I think that was the criticism of the Hobbit films, the Jackson Hobbit films, that you've taken a book that can be 80 pages in the shortest printings of it and made it into three-hour plus films. I mean, that's sensational and sensationalizing in a way. I did appreciate with the Hobbit films the amount of backstory that we get in terms of the White Council and the sort of many journeys of Gandalf. That was wonderful. But you're right, with Rings of Power, we haven't seen the merchandising yet, although I wouldn't put it out there. I mean, certainly all of the Amazon boxes and the envelopes that were sent out that had on it. There is potential for marketing, I think, still. I'm glad you mentioned the BBC adaptation, because, of course, that's another wonderful instance of hearing a recorded version that's not so much, the audiobooks that we've talked about, but is a sort of a nicely dramatized in a way, and does take its own sort of diversion, let's say, but is, I think, more faithful, as you're saying, to the series. So we have so much to think about, and that's what I hope the viewers and the super fans remember, is that every act of creating a Tolkien world is an adaptation to some extent, and that even Tolkien himself is the greatest Tolkien adapter. So there is a lot of expectation. I think every fan will bring their own reservations, expectations, the things that they love about the series. I am, as you said, very excited that we will get to the Land of Rune and we get to see places we never screen. That's the real beauty. That's what gives me hope in watching the series anyways, that I'm excited to see what develops, because it will cause me to go back and reread the text, to go back and check what does happen, what doesn't happen, not from the sense of being a strict fact checker, but to want to know, how is this world being adapted? What are the decisions? How might I have done it differently? And does it make sense in the world at large? If it doesn't make sense at the end of the day, that's when I might start having a problem. But if there's a good explanation and a true reason, then I think I can get behind it to a certain extent. So I think moving forward, are there other themes that we want to continue to think about as we continue to rewatch, reread, and rethink Tolkien's world?
I mean, I think what you just said there is a great point. Every adaptation will be adapted for each generation. This is one of those things that, whether it be King Arthur or whether it be Monkey King kind of adaptations for Chinese and Eastern audiences, there's always going to be an adaptation and how that relates. One of the major themes that I think myself and a few other people are concerned about is pride and greed in relation to the production of this show and who is running
the pride and greed on the part of the creators, right?
Yes,
which
yes,
is also
yes,
such a
yes,
great
yes.
theme in relation to Tolkien's world.
Exactly. So it's very interesting to see, and to your point, how fans like us and how we try to go back to the text and how we try to go back to the text each time. I think what's so great about having more and more adaptations is that we're able to compare and contrast, and we're able to dive right back into the original lore, into the original ideas and texts, and even the inspirations for those texts, and how we as people that consume this art develop and change because of those adaptations and because of those original texts, and how much they inspire us or how much they choose to help us out within these situations. And I think it's really interesting, like how we can reflect on something that was written in the 20th century, written going back to the Victorian, going back to the Edwardian era, someone that has a Victorian and an Edwardian mindset, and how we can look at that, critique it, assess it, and how we can look at it within a modern lens, and how we can see it, how it's related to us today. And I think even as more things come out, like The Fall of Numenor, which is coming out this week with Bryan Sibley, Alan Lee, and a bunch of other commentators, I think it'll be really interesting to see how us as fans who love this stuff can interact with new fans and how they want to interact, how they want to do it. I always say this about Tolkien and just in the world in general. I think he is able to capture this idea, and this is, one of his most major influences on popular culture, is that humanity as a whole has this inert idea of discovery. We have something that's so deeply inside us that we have to know more. I need to know more. I need to know more. What's the origin of this? What's the origin of that? How does this thing develop into this? What's the things that adapted, like who adapted this thing after the original thing, and how they adapted it to our world today, and how we can see it through our modern lens. And I think it's just something that is going to be talked about for years and years, until the next one, where they actually have a full-length series of the Lord of the Rings, where you can get all the songs, you can get Tom Bombadil, you can get the meanderings, you can get all of the main themes, you can get the Scouring of the Shire, the heartbreak, the sadness, but the ultimate joy, the eucatastrophe of it all in the end.
I agree. I mean, I think I like your point about fans and new fans to this series coming together. And I think if nothing else, that is the real joy of a fellowship. People coming from various backgrounds with various expectations, those who are long battle worn to the worlds of Middle Earth and the realms of Middle Earth, and those who are newer to it, like the hobbits. And I think coming together in a space like a fellowship and moving forward together is a kind of nice metaphor for this. So there's no shortage of themes that we can continue. I like that you mentioned Arthur a moment ago, because that occurs to me that just as there are Arthurian adaptations throughout the long Middle Ages of the 1,000 years that we consider the Middle Ages, and in the later adaptations of Arthur, there will be, as you rightly say, Tolkien adaptations. And so I think as we move forward, we'll no doubt continue to think about Tolkien, but I hope that together we can also think about some of the other medievalizing stories and films, like Arthur, like Beowulf, anything related to Robin Hood, all of the other great cinematic medievalisms that you and I could hopefully have conversations about as we move forward, and we bring in still more audiences to think about the Middle Ages on screen, legend and fantasy on screen, and what these films and stories mean centuries later for all of us in our lives today. Is that something that we can promise our listeners and viewers as we move forward?
100% yes. I'm really excited for that. I've always, wanted to do something like this to talk about the applicability of uh, medieval world today and how it is still such a fascinating period within the context of their popular culture ideas and how we can, learn from them.
Awesome. Well, David, it is always a pleasure. Thank you for this extended discussion. And we look forward to any comments, questions, posts, queries, anything in the comments below, and look forward for a few more recordings in the weeks and months to come. Thank you again. And Namarie, as always.
Namarie.